SABC Correspondent Trent Murray is in Tel Aviv and has been following all the proceedings at the Hague, where South Africa has taken Israel before the court on genocide allegations. The South African team tabled their submissions yesterday, and today, of course, was the Israelis' turn to defend these allegations. He joins us now for an update. Trent, a very good evening to you. Look, Israel tabling its rebuttal and defense today. What has been the general reaction on the ground?
Well, as you might imagine, it has been a major news event here over the past 48 hours, with all of Israel's television networks showing wall-to-wall coverage of the proceedings, both of South Africa's accusations and of Israel's response today. We have seen as well some government reaction from what Israel had to say in its defence. We've seen the foreign minister, for example, say in an online statement, I should say, "I am hopeful that the complaint will be outright dismissed, and I have faith that justice will prevail." He called South Africa's claims baseless and even accused Pretoria itself of breaching the Geneva Convention by, quote, supporting the terrorist organisation Hamas, which calls for the elimination of the State of Israel. We have also seen some reaction from the official spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry here, who says South Africa's genocide claim is designed to try and deny Israel's right to defend itself. And just at the United Nations, I should briefly mention, Israel's ambassador there has said it's the UN that should be sitting in the dock at the ICJ, not Israel. So look, that type of rhetoric, I don't think any surprise. Certainly leading up to this case, we heard those types of statements from, for example, the government spokesperson, who called this a blood libel and said South Africa's leaders would go down in history as expressing hypocrisy. I think this case clearly is a major deal for Israel, and they have, as we've seen today, defended it rigorously. We'll just have to wait and see how those 15 judges respond after 48 hours of hearings.
And absolutely, Trent, what we're getting from The Hague is that it's going to take about 10 days or so for the feedback to both parties. So, look, the Israeli legal team kept reiterating how Israel is currently fighting Hamas and not Gazans, and insisted that the South African submissions were distorted and biased, as we've just pointed out, begging the court to not overlook the fact that Israel has every right to defend itself again.
Yeah, that's right. And look, the kind of crux of their legal argument was that civilian casualties are always an unwanted expectation in war, if you will, an unwanted consequence, and they're trying to stress that they are fighting those Hamas militants and are not fighting the people of Gaza, and that they don't have genocidal intent. And I think that was really critical to the legal argument put forward by SA. We saw Israel, for example, point to the fact that it's dropped millions of paper leaflets on Gaza warning civilians to move to safe zones if there's going to be airstrikes or artillery fire. They also mentioned the text messages they send, the telephone calls. And I think what was critical as well was we saw SA mount a very strong case pointing to some of the public statements that have been made by senior Israeli government ministers, statements which were very inflammatory and controversial, including ones by the finance minister, for example, who had suggested that the people of Gaza could go and live in other third countries. We're not sure which countries they are, but nevertheless that was his proposal. What the legal team tried to do was say, look, those comments are taken out of context and they don't reflect the Israeli policy anyway, because the way the IDF conducts itself is a hierarchical structure. It answers to the war cabinet that is only a certain number of ministers, and those ministers have made clear that the IDF has to try and avoid civilian casualties. So effectively ignore what those kind of random ministers are saying and pay attention to what's actually happening on the ground. I mean, again, it's up to the judges to decide whether to take into account what some of those ministers have had to say. But it was certainly a strong rebuttal from Israel today against what was a very strong case brought forward by South Africa.
And Trent, I'm sure on the ground, the reaction is quite interesting and telling, probably pitting the two allies against each other. We heard the US saying that South Africa's legal action actually distracts from other diplomatic efforts. Yet we know that the US has actually vetoed every other diplomatic effort that has been tried, even tabled at the UN Security Council.
Yeah, well, that was that back and forth, wasn't it, around diplomatic channels aside from the ICJ, whether Pretoria had made representations to Tel Aviv before launching this case, whether they tried to find an alternative dispute resolution, for want of a better expression, pulling the trigger on this major international case at the UN's highest court. We understand the Israelis put forward a fairly extensive dossier which outlined what communications had taken place between South Africa and Israel before launching this case. But I think the broader issue now is we just have to wait and see what happens with that restraining order, if you will, that injunction. The actual case around genocide could take some time, months, but it's that initial restraining order we expect will take around 10 days to decide on. And if that comes back in the affirmative, well, it could have a major impact on the ground, because it could throw a real spanner into the works of Israel's military operations if the ICJ orders them to halt. And if they don't do that, well, then it places the US and Germany, for example, in a very tricky position, because they will have to then defend the fact that their ally Israel is ignoring international law. We may be slightly getting ahead of ourselves here, but this is just how high stakes the eventual decision is, which is why I think many people here, but also across this region, will be watching the result of South Africa's accusation very, very closely.